Welcome to Midnight Whispers, the place where the edge of the map meets the edge of reason. Tonight we slip into Alaska, a frozen land where even the daylight feels haunted and the aurora sways like restless spirits. Out here, the roads vanish, cabins rot under snow, and whispers crawl through the pines. These are real stories, drawn from the people who've lived here long enough to know what moves in the dark. Before we start, hit subscribe and tap the bell so the next time the cold calls, you're ready. The night's already settling in, and the first story waits like a shadow at the tree line. Step closer, but not too close. Story 1. Village that walked into nothing. The stew was still warm when I found the first cabin, steam rising from the pot on the stove, but there wasn't a soul in sight for 20 miles in any direction. I am a bush pilot, been flying supplies to remote villages across Alaska and northern Canada for 19 years. I've seen isolation that would break most people, landed on ice strips where one mistake means death, delivered medicine to places so remote they don't appear on maps. But nothing prepared me for what I found at Anjikuni Lake in November of 2004, and nothing will ever make me fly over that. The village wasn't on my regular route. I got a call from a mining company working the region, said they'd been trying to reach the Inuit settlement for 3 weeks with no response. Radio silence, which wasn't unusual given the equipment they had, but the company had supplies scheduled for delivery and wanted someone to check if everything was okay. They offered me 3 times my normal rate. I should have asked why they were paying so much for a simple supply run. I flew out on a clear morning, rare for November, visibility stretching for miles over the endless white landscape. Anjikuni Lake was a dark scar in the snow, frozen solid, surrounded by sparse trees and rolling tundra. The village sat on the eastern shore, maybe 30 structures, a mix of traditional and modern construction. Smoke should have been rising from chimneys. There was nothing. I circled twice before landing on the lake ice, checking for activity, looking for any signs of life. The village appeared deserted, but not abandoned. Snowmobiles parked near cabins, sleds lined up, fishing equipment stacked and ready. Everything looked normal except for the complete absence of people. I taxied close to shore and killed the engine. The silence was immediate and oppressive, the kind of quiet that only exists in the deep Arctic where there is nothing to make sound. No dogs barking, no children playing, no generators running, just wind and the creaking of my cooling engine. The first cabin I entered had the stew on the stove, still warm, meaning someone had been cooking within the last hour. The table was set for dinner, 6 places, food already plated and waiting. But no one had sat down to eat. Coats hung by the door, boots lined up neatly, everything suggesting the occupants had just stepped out for a moment. Except they hadn't stepped out. They were gone. I checked the next cabin, then the next. Every single one was the same. Meals prepared, fires burning in stoves, personal belongings untouched. In one home, I found a baby, its crib with the blanket still warm, a bottle half finished sitting nearby. The parents had been feeding their child minutes before I arrived, and then they simply vanished. The village had a small community center, and that's where I found the radio. It was on, tuned to the emergency frequency, but nobody was there to use it. On the table next to it was a logbook, entries dating back months. The last one from that morning. It was written in Inuktitut, but I could make out the date and time, November 14th, 9:47 a.m. I landed at 10:15. Whatever had happened in the last half hour. I went outside and started calling out, my voice echoing across the frozen lake. No response. I fired my flare gun, the red burst climbing into the gray sky, visible for miles. Nothing. I searched every building, every storage shed, every possible place someone could be hiding or sheltering. The village was completely empty. But here is what made my hands start shaking. There were no tracks in the snow. None. The village should have been covered in footprints, paths worn between buildings, evidence of daily life. Instead, the snow around every structure was pristine, undisturbed except for my own prints. It was like everyone had simply lifted off the ground and floated away. I found the graveyard on the edge of the village, a small plot with traditional markers and crosses. And that is where things got truly disturbing. Several graves had been dug up from the inside, dirt and snow pushed out from below, creating craters where bodies should have been resting. The coffins were empty, lids torn off, the frozen ground excavated by something with enormous strength. My radio crackled to life, the mining company asking for a status update. I told them the village was deserted, everyone gone, no signs of struggle or explanation. There was a long pause before they responded, asking me to check the ice near the village, look for any unusual markings or disturbances. I walked out onto the lake, the ice thick enough to support a truck. And that is when I saw them. Footprints, thousands of them, all heading in the same direction, away from the village toward the center of the lake. Men, women, children, all walking in a steady procession, prints pressed deep into the snow that had fallen on the ice. I followed them, my heart hammering, my breath coming in short gasps that had nothing to do with exertion. The prints continued for maybe a quarter mile, then they just stopped. All of them, simultaneously, in the middle of the lake. No indication they turned around, no signs of vehicles picking them up, no explanation. Just hundreds of footprints ending in the middle of nowhere, but there was something at the stopping point. A hole in the ice, roughly circular, maybe 20 feet across, edges perfectly smooth like it had been cut with a laser. The water below was black and moving, which should have been impossible given the ice was 3 feet thick everywhere else. And around the hole, pressed into the snow, were marks I couldn't identify. Not footprints, not animal tracks, something else entirely. Curved impressions, like something massive had been resting there, waiting. I ran back to my plane, no longer caring about the investigation or the mining company, this money. I just wanted off that lake, away from that village, back to civilization where things made sense. But my plane wouldn't start. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch, like something was preventing ignition. I tried everything, checked every system, but nothing worked. That is when I heard the singing. It came from the direction of the hole, faint at first but growing louder. Voices in harmony, hundreds of them, singing in Inuktitut. The melody was beautiful and terrible, a sound that made me want to walk toward it and run away simultaneously. I could see figures now, emerging from the water, pulling themselves onto the ice, dark shapes against the white landscape. The villagers were returning, but they were wrong. I could see that even from a distance. They moved in unison, no individual variation, no personality in their movements. Like puppets controlled by the same hand, they walked back toward the village in perfect formation, their wet clothes freezing instantly in the Arctic air. I hid in the community center, watching through a window as they filed past. Their faces were blank, expressions empty, eyes reflecting light in a way human eyes shouldn't. They returned to their homes, sat at their tables, picked up their lives exactly where they left off. Except they weren't the same people anymore. Something had taken them down into that dark water and brought back copies, close enough to pass at a distance but fundamentally wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. My radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't the mining company. It was a voice speaking in Inuktitut, translated through some kind of automatic system into broken English. The voice said they'd been sleeping, that the disturbance had woken them, that they needed to replenish. It said my plane would work now, that I should leave and never return, that I should tell no one what I'd seen. The voice said there were other villages, other places where they slept beneath the ice, waiting for the time when they need to feed again. It said the people of Anjikuni Lake had been called, had walked willingly into the water, had joined something older than human civilization. My engine started on the first try. I took off without filing a flight plan, flew straight back to Anchorage, and quit my job the next day. The mining company never contacted me about payment, never asked for a report. When I tried to find information about Anjikuni Lake, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The village I visited didn't exist on any current maps. There was an Anjikuni Lake, yes, but according to records, the Inuit settlement there had been abandoned in 1930 after the entire population mysteriously vanished. It had been a famous mystery at the time, investigated by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, but eventually written off as mass migration or epidemic. But I'd been there. I'd seen the cabins, the food, the warm stew. I'd watched the villagers return from beneath the ice, unless they landed at a different lake entirely, which was impossible given my navigation equipment. Unless the village had been recreated somehow, populated by something that wasn't quite human. Or unless the village had never really been abandoned, had continued existing in some parallel space, visible only to those who stumbled upon it at the wrong time. A feeding ground that appeared and disappeared, collecting the unwary, adding them to whatever was sleeping in the depths. I've spent the last few years researching remote village disappearances across the Arctic. There are dozens of them, settlements that vanished overnight, populations that walked away from their homes with no explanation. The Inuit have stories about things that live under the ice, ancient beings that predate human habitation, that sometimes call people to join them in the cold dark below. Last month, I got a package. No return address, just my name and city. Inside was a photograph, recent based on the digital timestamp. It showed Anjikuni Lake from the air, the village clearly visible on the eastern shore, smoke rising from chimneys, people moving between buildings. And standing in the center of the village, looking up at the camera, was me. Same jacket, same face, but with those wrong eyes that reflected light like an animal. I was smiling, waving at the camera, standing among the others who had been called and answered. I've never been back to that lake. I know I haven't, but the photograph says otherwise, and I can't explain it any more than I can explain the village that appeared and disappeared, or the people who walked into nothing and came back as something else. Sometimes I wonder if I really made it off that lake, or if what returned to Anchorage was just a copy, close enough to fool everyone, including itself. I wonder if the real me is still there, sitting in that community center, watching others arrive and become like the rest. And I wonder how many other villages are out there, hidden in the Arctic waste, populated by things wearing human faces, waiting for the next person who flies too close and sees too much, waiting to call them home to the ice. Story 2. Phantom frequency of the Dalton Highway. I should have never stopped the truck. That is what I keep telling myself now, sitting in this motel room in Fairbanks with the door triple locked and every light burning. But at mile marker 312 on the Dalton Highway, with nothing but frozen darkness stretching in every direction, I heard something on the CB radio that changed everything. A voice that shouldn't have been there. A voice that knew things it couldn't possibly know. Let me back up. I've been running freight up to Dead Horse for 11 years. The Dalton is 414 miles of the loneliest road in America, cutting through the Brooks Range into the Arctic. In winter, it is 20 hours of black ice and whiteouts and temperatures that will freeze diesel in your lines if you're not careful. Most drivers want to touch it, but the pay is good, and I always liked the solitude, the emptiness, or I did, until 3 nights ago. I was 40 miles past Coldfoot, which is the last real outpost before you hit true wilderness. No cell service, no other vehicles for hours. Just me, my Kenworth, and 40,000 pounds of drilling equipment headed north. The kind of run where your own thoughts become the only company, and even those start to feel intrusive after a while. The CB had been quiet all night. That's normal up there. Most of the chatter happens further south, where there is actually civilization to talk about. But around 2 in the morning, I started picking up static. Not unusual. The aurora borealis plays hell with radio signals in winter. But this static had a rhythm to it, a pattern that sounded almost like breathing. I reached for the dial to switch channels when the breathing stopped. And a man's voice came through, calm and clear as if you were sitting right beside me in the cab. North 70 degrees, 23 minutes, 41 seconds. West 149 degrees, 56 minutes, 17 seconds. Just coordinates, nothing else. Then silence. I waited, hand frozen on the steering wheel. The highway stretched ahead in my headlights, snow swirling across the pavement. Nothing but white and black and the distant silhouettes of mountains I couldn't quite see. The voice came again, same coordinates, same flat, emotionless tone, like someone reading a grocery list. Hello, I tried on the CB. This is Kodiak 77. You need assistance. No response, just wind and static. Then, north 70 degrees, 23 minutes, 41 seconds. West 149 degrees, 56 minutes, 17 seconds. I grabbed my phone out of habit before remembering it was useless up here. No signal, no GPS, no connection to anything. I had a Garmin unit mounted on the dash though. Professional grade, the kind that still works when everything else fails. My hands were shaking as I punched in the coordinates. The location appeared on screen. 23 miles west of my current position. Deep in the wilderness. No roads, no trails, no infrastructure of any kind. Just empty tundra and scattered spruce forest that thinned out into nothing as you went north. The voice continued its loop. Same coordinates, over and over, never varying. I counted. Every 47 seconds, the message repeated. I should have kept driving. That is what every instinct screamed at me to do. But here, it's the thing about long-haul driving in places like the Dalton. You develop a code. If someone is in trouble, you help. Because one day, it might be you out there, freezing or broken down or dying, and you'll pray that whoever hears your distress call doesn't, to just keep on driving. At mile marker 314, I found a turnout. Just a wide spot in the road where maintenance crews could park their equipment. I pulled over and killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was absolute. The kind of quiet that has weight, that presses against your eardrums. I grabbed my cold weather gear, my flashlight, and my Garmin. The temperature outside was minus 32. Without proper clothing, they got maybe 20 minutes before frostbite sets in. Maybe an hour before hypothermia kills you. I wasn't planning to be out long. Just wanted to get high enough to see if there was anything visible from the road. Smoke from a fire, lights from a vehicle, anything that might explain the transmission. The moment I stepped out of the cab, I felt watched. I've spent enough time alone in wilderness to know the difference between paranoia and genuine unease. This was the latter. The hairs on my neck stood up. My breath came faster, fogging in great clouds. I scanned the darkness, but my flashlight beam just dissolved into the void after 20 feet. The stars overhead were brilliant and cold and utterly indifferent. I started hiking west, checking my Garmin every few minutes. The terrain was brutal, frozen tussocks of grass that twisted my ankles, hidden ice patches, small ravines that appeared without warning. After 20 minutes, I covered maybe half a mile. At this rate, reaching the coordinates would take hours. Hours I didn't have, not in this cold. But then I saw something that made me stop dead. Tire tracks, fresh ones, cutting across the tundra at an angle. Not from a truck like mine, something smaller, an SUV maybe, or a pickup. They headed northwest, roughly in the direction of the coordinates. Nobody drives off-road up here. The permafrost makes it nearly impossible, and the environmental regulations mean massive fines if you caught damaging the tundra. But someone had done it recently, within the last day or two, judging by how crisp the tracks looked. I followed them, not because it was smart, but because now I needed to know. The tracks led me over a low ridge and down into a shallow valley where stunted spruce trees clustered together like frightened animals. The wind picked up, howling through the branches with a sound that was almost human. Almost. That's when I found the truck. It was a Ford F-250, maybe 10 years old, parked at the edge of the tree line. The driver, his door hung open. Snow had drifted into the cab, covering the seats. The engine was cold, dead for at least a day. I played my flashlight over the interior. A thermos on the passenger seat. A map covered in handwritten notes I couldn't hear it from where I stood. And on the dashboard, a CB radio still powered on, display glowing faintly. I checked my Garmin. The coordinates from the broadcast were less than a quarter mile ahead. "Hello," I called out. My voice sounded small and foolish. "Anyone here?" The forest swallowed my words. Nothing answered. I looked back the way I'd come. My own truck was invisible from here, hidden behind the ridge. The sensible thing would be to return to the highway. Call this in when I reached Dead Horse. Let the proper authorities deal with it. But I was so close now, and whoever owned this Ford might still be alive, might be injured and freezing somewhere just ahead. I kept walking. The trees thinned out after 100 yards. The land opened into a clearing, roughly circular, about the size of a baseball diamond. The snow here was undisturbed except for one thing. In the exact center of the clearing, illuminated by my flashlight beam, was a single human footprint. Not a trail of prints, not a set of tracks, just one. A left foot, facing north, pressed deep into the snow as if someone had been standing there with all their weight on that one leg. The print was fresh enough that I could see the tread pattern. A hiking boot, size 10 or 11. I walked around it slowly, searching for any other marks. There was nothing. The snow around the print was smooth and unmarked. No sign of how the person had arrived or departed. Just that one impossible footprint, frozen in place. I checked my Garmin one more time. The coordinates from the radio transmission matched this spot exactly. I was standing on them. The wind died completely. In the sudden silence, I heard the voice again. But not from my radio, from everywhere at once. filling the clearing like it was coming from the air itself. North 70 degrees, 23 minutes, 41 seconds. West 149 degrees, 56 minutes, 17 seconds. My flashlight flickered, went dark, came back on. The footprint was gone. The snow where it had been was smooth and untouched, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. But I could see my own prints now, circling around the spot where it had been. Proof I hadn't imagined it. I backed away slowly, not wanting to turn around, not wanting to show my back to whatever was happening here. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might crack a rib. Every shadow between the trees seemed to move, to lean closer. I could feel attention on me, heavy and cold and patient. That is when I saw them. Other footprints, dozens of them, all the same size, all left feet, scattered throughout the clearing like someone had been hopping around on one leg. But they appeared gradually, fading into existence as I watched. First one, then 3, then 10, then too many to count. All facing different directions, all pressed deep into the snow. I ran. I crashed back through the trees with no thought for stealth or safety. Branches tore at my face. I tripped over roots and went down hard. The wind knocked out of me. The voice followed me, broadcasting from the darkness. North 70 degrees, 23 minutes, 41 seconds. West 149 degrees, 56 minutes, 17 seconds. Over and over, patient and calm and utterly wrong. When I reached the ford, I saw that the map on the passenger seat had changed. The handwritten notes were different now. They were coordinates, hundreds of them, written in tiny, precise script, covering every inch of the paper. And they were all the same numbers, repeated endlessly. I didn't stop to investigate further. I scrambled up the ridge and half ran, half fell back to my truck. The CB was still broadcasting the voice, filling my cab with those terrible coordinates. I grabbed the radio and hurled it out into the snow. The sudden silence was almost worse. I fired up the engine and pulled back onto the highway, pushing the Kenworth harder than I should have. 45, 50, 55 miles per hour on ice that could send me spinning into the void with one wrong move. I didn't care. I needed distance. I needed lights and people and proof that the world still made sense. At Coldfoot, I stopped long enough to tell the attendant about the abandoned Ford. He listened with the flat expression of someone who has heard too many strange stories from drivers coming off the Dalton. Coordinates, huh? He said, pouring coffee with steady hands. How long you been up? I know what I saw. He nodded slowly. State troopers will check it out. But listen, you're not the first person to mention weird radio signals up there. Been happening for years. Started back in 97, near as we can figure. Some trucker named Morrison went off the road around mile marker 300. They found his rig a week later, 20 miles into the wilderness. No sign of Morrison himself, just his footprints. Heading north, they followed the trail for 3 miles before it just stopped. Single print in the snow. Then nothing. What happened to him? No one knows. But ever since then, drivers report picking up a voice broadcasting coordinates. Usually it's Morrison, yes, the spot where his trail ended. But sometimes the coordinates change, like whatever is out there is moving or spreading. I drank my coffee, trying to process this. Why doesn't anyone do anything about it? He shrugged. What is to do? It's just radio static. Probably some atmospheric phenomenon bouncing signals around. Happens all the time up here. But his eyes told a different story. He believed something else entirely. I made it to Dead Horse and delivered my load. Turned around and headed south without stopping longer than necessary. I kept waiting for the voice to return, to break through on some frequency I couldn't avoid. But the radio stayed blessedly silent. Until mile marker 312. I was passing the same turnout where I stopped before. And that is when I saw it, in my side mirror, barely visible in the darkness. A figure standing beside the road. Too far away to make out details. But I could see it was a person. Standing on one leg, the other leg raised, foot hovering above the snow. I pressed down on the accelerator. Didn't look back. When I reached Fairbanks, I told the dispatcher I was taking time off. He didn't argue, said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. Close enough, I suppose. The thing is, I can't stop thinking about that map in the Ford. All those coordinates, written over and over in that obsessive script. And I keep wondering, how many of them were different locations? How many footprints are out there now, scattered across the wilderness. How many people have heard that voice and followed it into the dark? Last night, I plugged my Garmin into my laptop. I wanted to clear the waypoint, erase the coordinates from my device, this memory. But when I opened the data file, I found something that stopped my blood cold. My Garmin had recorded a route, not the drive up the Dalton, not my hike into the wilderness. A route that started at the clearing with the footprints and extended north, 273 miles into the Brooks Range, into territories so remote it doesn't even have a name. The route ended at another set of coordinates, marked with a simple notation. Origin. I didn't create that route. I didn't deprogram those waypoints. But they in my device now, saved and waiting. And every night, around 2 in the morning, my laptop speakers pick up something. Just static mostly, but sometimes, underneath the white noise, I can hear it. That calm voice, reading coordinates. Different coordinates now, closer to Fairbanks. I've been checking the news obsessively. 3 days ago, a hiker went missing in the White Mountains, about 80 miles north of here. They found his campsite intact, his gear all accounted for, but no sign of him, just a single footprint in the mud beside his tent. Yesterday, someone reported a strange radio transmission near Chena Hot Springs. A voice broadcasting coordinates. When the authorities checked the location, they found nothing but an empty clearing and one frozen footprint. The broadcasts are spreading. Whatever is out there, whatever took Morrison back in '97, it's not staying in one place anymore. It's moving south, getting closer to civilization, and it is calling out, constantly calling out coordinates, luring people away from safety, one transmission at a time. I keep thinking about that clearing, about the impossible footprints appearing one by one, about the way they all face different directions, like someone searching for something. Or like something searching for someone. My Garmin is sitting on the desk in front of me. I should destroy it, smash it with a hammer and burn the pieces. But I can't stop looking at that road it recorded. That path leading north to origin. Part of me needs to know what is there. What started all of this? What's really broadcasting those coordinates into the darkness? But the smarter part of me, the part that kept me alive for 11 years on the Dalton, knows the truth. Some frequencies should never be answered. Some coordinates should never be followed. And some footprints in the snow are meant as warnings, not destinations. I'm leaving Alaska tomorrow, driving south until I hit somewhere warm and populated and so far from the wilderness that the only voices I hear are human. I'm telling myself I'll never go back. That I'll find a new job hauling freight through somewhere sensible, somewhere the darkness doesn't have teeth. But late at night, when the world is quiet and still, I feel it. That same sensation I felt in the clearing, the weight of attention, the patient, cold certainty that something is watching me, waiting, and I know, with absolute conviction, that the voice will find me again. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but eventually, my radio will crackle to life, and I'll hear those coordinates, and they'll all be different ones this time. They'll all be mine. Story 3. Thing that fell with the snow. I stopped believing in coincidences the winter. My neighbor, his face turned black. It happened 3 days after the storm. The storm that lasted 48 hours straight and dumped 7 feet of snow on our town in northern Montana. 7 feet in 2 days. The kind of snowfall that buries cars, collapses roofs, and cuts communities off from the rest of the world. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what fell with it. I am getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. My name is Michael Torres. I am a telephone lineman for a rural utility company, which means I spend most of my time in bucket trucks fixing lines that ice and wind have torn down. It is honest work, and it keeps me in Cedar Falls, a town of maybe 400 people tucked into the mountains where Montana meets the Canadian border. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the general store closes at 5, and where winters can kill you if you're not careful. The storm hit on a Tuesday in February. I was in my garage working on my snowmobile when the first flakes started coming down. Within an hour, the wind was screaming like something alive, and the snow was falling so thick I couldn't see my own truck in the driveway. I went inside, made coffee, and settled in. I lived through plenty of Montana blizzards. I knew the drill. What I didn't know was that this storm was different. By Wednesday afternoon, the power was out across the entire county. My boss called on the landline, told me to sit tight, said the roads were impassable and there was nothing we could do until it cleared. I spent that night and the next day watching the snow pile higher and higher against my windows, listening to the wind tear at the roof, feeling the house groan under the weight of it all. When the storm finally stopped on Thursday morning, the silence was absolute. That's what I remembered most clearly. The complete and total absence of sound. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just that heavy, suffocating quiet that comes after a massive snowfall, like the world had been wrapped in cotton and sealed away. I was outside by 9, digging out my front door, when I noticed something odd in the snow. Little white clumps scattered across the surface, almost like cotton balls or dandelion fluff, but denser. Fibrous. They looked out of place, too white against the blue white of the snow. And they had this strange texture, like artificial material, like insulation or packing material. I picked one up with my gloved hand. It was light, almost weightless, and when I squeezed it, it compressed but didn't break apart. It felt wrong somehow. Synthetic. I tossed it aside and kept digging, figuring it was just debris from someone's shed or camper that had been torn apart in the storm. By noon, I had a path cleared to my truck. That's when I saw my neighbor, Dale Brennan, working on his own driveway across the street. Dale was 72, a retired forest ranger who lived in Cedar Falls his entire life. Tough as nails, the kind of man who split his own firewood and refused to use a snowblower on principle. He waved at me. I waved back. Everything seemed normal. That was the last time I saw him look human. The town started digging out that afternoon. The county plows came through, clearing the main roads first, and people emerged from their homes like survivors from bunkers. Everyone was talking about the storm, about the damage, about how they'd never seen anything quite like it. But nobody was talking about the white clumps yet. Not until Sarah Mendelson touched one with her bare hands. Sarah ran the general store. She was outside her shop that evening, sweeping snow off the steps, when she apparently picked up one of those fibrous balls. I heard about it from Tom Wickstrom, whose wife worked at the tiny urgent care clinic we had in town. Sarah came in around 7, Tom said, with her right hand wrapped in a towel. When the nurse unwrapped it, the skin was black, not frostbitten purple or red, but black, necrotic, like something had burned it from the inside out. The blackness spread from her palm up her fingers in spiderweb patterns, following her veins, and the skin was cold to the touch. Colder than ice. The nurse called the doctor, who never seen anything like it, and they wrapped it in sterile dressings and told her to keep it elevated. But that wasn't what scared Sarah the most. She told the nurse she could hear humming, a high-pitched sound, like electrical feedback or a mosquito trapped in her ear canal. Constant, maddening, and it was getting louder. Nobody else could hear it. The doctor checked her ears, found nothing. They thought maybe it was tinnitus brought on by stress or shock. They gave her pain medication and sent her home with instructions to come back in the morning. By morning, 3 more people had the same symptoms. I learned about it Friday when I stopped at the general store for coffee. Sarah wasn't there. Her daughter Emma was running the counter, and she looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying. She told me what had happened, how her mother's entire right arm had turned black overnight, how she was screaming about the humming, how it was so loud now she couldn't sleep, couldn't think. And she wasn't the only one. Marcus Chen, who owned the gas station, Beth Holloway, a school teacher, and Dale, my neighbor Dale, all of them had touched those white fibrous clumps. All of them had the same black, frozen skin. All of them heard the humming that nobody else could hear. That is when the fear started spreading faster than the blackness. The doctor, Stephen Kaufman, tried to call the county health department, but the phone lines were still down from the storm. He tried his cell phone, but there was no signal out here on a good day, and the storm had knocked out the nearest tower. We were cut off, isolated, alone with whatever this thing was. Doc Kaufman held a meeting at the community center that afternoon. Maybe 100 people showed up, which was a quarter of the town. He stood at the front, looking pale and tired, and told us what he knew. 4 people had been affected. The condition was spreading up their limbs, following their circulatory systems. The tissue was dying, but in a way he'd never seen before. It was as if something was crystallizing their blood, freezing them from the inside at a cellular level, despite the fact that their core body temperatures remained normal. And all of them reported the humming. A sound that was getting louder and more complex, almost like it was forming patterns. Music without melody, words without language. Someone asked if it was contagious. Doc Kaufman said he didn't. He thinks so, as long as people didn't touch the white material. But he couldn't, to be sure. Someone else asked what the white stuff was. Nobody knew. It had appeared during the storm, mixed with the snow. Thousands of tiny fibrous balls scattered across the entire town. That is when Marcus Chen stood up from where he was sitting in the back. His left hand was completely black now, and the darkness had spread up past his elbow. His face was gray, and he was sweating despite the cold. He stood there swaying slightly, and everyone turned to look at him. Then he spoke, and his voice was wrong, flat, mechanical, like someone reading words they didn't understand. He said the humming was music. He said it was beautiful. He said it was calling him home. Then he walked out of the community center, and nobody tried to stop him. We were all too shocked, too frightened. By the time someone thought to follow him, he was gone. They found him the next morning in his backyard, lying in the snow. His entire body was black, frozen solid, dead. But here, it's the thing that made my blood run cold when Tom Wickstrom told me about it. Marcus, this body was surrounded by those white fibrous clumps. Dozens of them. And they were moving, pulsing, like they were breathing. That is when people started leaving, or trying to. The main highway was still half buried, but some folks loaded up their trucks in four-wheel drives and attempted to make it to the next town 40 miles south. I watched them go, lines of vehicles churning through the snow, and I stayed behind. I had a job to do, power lines to fix, plus, something in me needed to understand what was happening. By Saturday, 2 more people were infected. Both had touched the material, just like the others. But what worried Doc Kaufman more was that Sarah Mendelson and Beth Holloway were starting to change in other ways. Their eyes were turning white, not clouded over like cataracts, but actually white, milky and reflective, and they stopped complaining about the humming. When the doctor asked Sarah about it, she smiled. She said the humming had become clear. She said she could understand it now. She said it was telling her things. Beautiful things. Things about where it came from and why it was here. The doctor asked her to explain. She said she couldn't. Not in words we would understand. Not yet. That's when I decided to investigate on my own. Sunday morning, I geared up like I was heading into a hazmat situation. Heavy coat, 3 layers of gloves, ski goggles, a respirator mask I used for painting. I looked ridiculous, but I wasn't taking any chances. I grabbed a metal bucket and a long stick, and I went out into my backyard where I seen the highest concentration of those white clumps. Up close, they were even stranger than I thought. Under the morning sun, they seemed almost luminescent, with a faint glow that came from within. The fibrous strands were incredibly fine, almost like silk, but with a crystalline quality. When I used the stick to lift one into the bucket, it left a residue on the metal. A frost pattern that spread outward in perfect geometric shapes. Fractals. I brought the bucket into my garage and set up a makeshift examination area. I had a magnifying glass, a flashlight, and a whole lot of curiosity that was probably going to get me killed. Using the stick, I carefully pulled apart one of the clumps. Inside was a structure, a framework of impossibly delicate strands arranged in a pattern that hurt to look at. It was too complex, too perfect, mathematical, and at the center, something that looked almost like a seed or a spore, but made of ice, or something that looked like ice but wasn't. It was too white, too cold. When I brought the flashlight close, I could see things moving inside it. Shadows, shapes. That's when I heard it. The humming. Faint at first, barely audible even in the silence of my garage. But definitely there. A high-pitched tone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, that vibrated in my bones and made my teeth ache. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering, and the sound faded. But not completely. It was still there, at the very edge of my hearing, like a frequency my brain could almost but not quite process. I sealed the bucket with duct tape and plastic sheeting and threw it in my truck. I didn't know what to do with it, but I knew I couldn't keep it in my house. As I worked, I kept checking my gloved hands, terrified I'd see black spreading across my skin. But there was nothing. The layers of protection had worked. That afternoon, Dale Brennan walked into the forest. His wife found a note on the kitchen table. It said he was sorry, but he had to go where the humming was calling him. She called the volunteer fire department, and they organized a search party. I joined them, along with maybe 20 others. We spent hours combing the woods behind Dale's property, following his tracks in the deep snow. We found him at sunset, standing in a clearing about 2 miles in. He was facing north, perfectly still, and his entire body was black. Frozen, but he was still alive. His chest was moving, slow and rhythmic, like he was breathing in time with something we couldn't hear. His white eyes were open and staring at the sky. Around him, the ground was covered with those fibrous clumps. Hundreds of them, thousands. They created a circle maybe 30 feet across, and inside that circle, the snow had taken on a strange blue luminescence. The air felt different there, thicker, raw. We tried to get close to Dale, but the moment anyone stepped into that circle, they heard it. The humming, loud and overwhelming, like stepping into a jet engine. 2 men fell to their knees, hands over their ears, shouting that they couldn't stand it. We pulled them back, and Dale just stood there, unmoving, his black frozen skin reflecting the dying light. We had no choice but to leave him. What else could we do? We weren't equipped for this. We didn't understand what we were dealing with. As we hiked back in the darkness, I looked over my shoulder and saw that the clearing was glowing, pulsing with that same blue luminescence, like a beacon or a signal. That night, all the infected people left their homes. Sarah, Beth, Dale, his wife said he never came back from the forest, but the others walked out into the snow and didn't return. By morning, they were gone. 7 people total. Doc Kaufman organized another search, but we all knew it was pointless. They'd gone to the forest, to wherever the humming was calling them. The town was fracturing. Half the population had already left, and the other half was trapped between fear and the need to help the infected. The county finally managed to send a helicopter on Monday, and they evacuated Doc Kaufman and the most vulnerable residents. But the pilot refused to make a second trip. He said there was something wrong with the area. His instruments were malfunctioning. His radio was picking up interference, a high-pitched tone that shouldn't have been there. By Tuesday, the fibrous material had stopped appearing. The snow was just snow again. But the damage was done. 14 people were infected now. All of them had walked into the forest. None of them had come back. I made a decision then. I had to know what was happening in those woods. I had to see where they'd gone. So Wednesday morning, I loaded my truck with supplies, strapped on my snowshoes, and headed north into the forest, following the tracks. The trees were silent. No birds, no animals, just that oppressive quiet and the crunch of my snowshoes. After an hour, I started seeing them. The clearings, dozens of them, scattered through the forest, each one marked by those glowing blue circles of fibrous material. And in the center of each clearing stood one of the infected, frozen black and still, their white eyes staring at the sky. They were arranged in a pattern. I could see it from a ridge, looking down at the forest. The clearings formed a shape, a massive geometric design that stretched for miles. And at the center, where all the lines converged, was something that made my mind refuse to process what I was seeing. A structure, but not built, grown, formed from ice and those white fibers and something else. Something that shifted and moved and hurt to look at directly. It rose from the forest floor like a tower, maybe 50 feet high, spiraling upward in impossible angles. And from its peak, a beam of blue light shot straight up into the gray sky. The humming was everywhere here. So loud I could feel it in my chest, in my skull, vibrating through every cell of my body. I fell to my knees in the snow, hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside me now, and that is when I understood. The fibrous material wasn't the debris from the storm. It was the storm, or it came with the storm, from somewhere else, somewhere cold and dark and impossibly far away. It had fallen with the snow, scattered across our town, waiting for someone to touch it, to make contact. And when they did, it changed them, prepared them, turned them into something that could survive where it came from, or maybe into something that could help it grow. The infected people weren't dying. They were transforming, becoming part of whatever this thing was. This organism or intelligence or invasion that had drifted down from the sky on a Tuesday in February and decided to make Cedar Falls its home. I stumbled backward, away from the clearing, my vision blurring. I had to get out, had to warn someone. But as I turned to run, I saw them. All 14 of the infected, standing in a circle around me. Their black frozen bodies, their white eyes, watching me. And behind them, More of those fibrous clumps were falling from the trees like snow, floating down on currents of air that shouldn't have existed in the still forest. Falling toward me. I ran. God help me. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, crashing through the snow, falling and scrambling and running some more. I don't. Do you know how I made it back to my truck? I don't. Do you remember the drive home? All I remember is the humming, following me, growing fainter but never disappearing completely. I'm leaving Cedar Falls tomorrow. The roads are clear now, and there's nothing left to stay for. Most of the town is already gone. The ones who remain don't want to talk about what happened. They pretend everything is normal, that people didn't just walk into the forest and never come back, that their ISN to a tower of ice and alien material growing in the woods 3 miles north of Main Street. But I can still hear it sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, that humming, just at the edge of perception. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that blue light shooting up into the sky like a message or a beacon, calling to something, waiting for an answer. I don't know if I was exposed. I don't know if those few seconds in the clearing were enough. I check my hands every hour, looking for signs of blackness, listening for the humming to get louder. So far, nothing, but I know it's only a matter of time, because it's what nobody wants to admit. That storm wasn't too random. It was too precise, too targeted. It dropped exactly the right amount of snow to isolate us. It lasted exactly long enough to spread that material across the entire area. And now that I've seen that tower, that structure in the forest, I understand what it really is. It is not an endpoint. It is a beginning. And when the next storm comes, when the next town gets buried under 7 feet of snow and finds strange white clumps scattered across their yards, they'll touch them too, out of curiosity or accident or carelessness. And they'll hear the humming, and they'll all walk into the forest, and they'll all become part of something vast and cold and utterly inhuman that fell from the sky and decided our world was suitable for colonization. I am writing this as a warning. If you ever see fibrous white material mixed with snow, don't touch it. Don't go near it. Don't try to understand it. Just leave. Get as far away as you can and don't look back. Because the humming never stops. Once you hear it, it's inside you forever. And eventually, no matter how far you run or how hard you fight, you will hear it calling you home. To the cold, to the darkness, to whatever waits in the spaces between the stars, patient and ancient and hungry for a world to claim as its own. Story 4. Mirror Plague. I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. Mirrors are not windows. They are doors. And in March of 1983, every door in my neighborhood opened at the same time. My name is Robert Hayes. I was 32 years old and living in the Spencer district of Anchorage, Alaska. I was a sales manager for a paper supply company, divorced, living alone in a rental house on Benson Boulevard. My life was ordinary in every possible way, until the mirrors changed. It started on a Tuesday morning. I was brushing my teeth, staring at my reflection like I had done 10,000 times before. But something felt wrong. I could not place it at first. Just a nagging sensation that the bathroom behind me in the mirror was not quite right. I turned around to check. Everything looked normal. The towel rack, the shower curtain, the small window above the toilet, all exactly where they should be. But when I looked back at the mirror, the towel rack was on the wrong wall. Not by much, just shifted about 3 feet to the left. And the shower curtain was a different color. Not the faded blue I had bought at Sears. This one was darker, almost navy. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, looked again. The mirror showed the wrong bathroom. My bathroom, but different, rearranged, like someone had moved things while I was not paying attention. I reached out and touched the glass. It was cold, colder than it should have been. My reflection reached back, matching my movement perfectly. Everything else was wrong, but my reflection was still mine. Still me. I told myself I was tired, stressed from work, maybe coming down with something. I splashed water on my face and left for work without looking in the mirror again. But the wrongness followed me. At the office, I caught my reflection in a window. The room behind me had the filing cabinets on the opposite side. When I looked at the actual room, they were where they had always been. By lunchtime, I knew something was happening, something impossible, and I was not the only one who noticed. Karen Donnelly from across the street called me that evening. She sounded shaken. She asked if I had noticed anything strange about my mirrors. I told her I had. She went quiet for a long moment, then said she was coming over. She needed to show me something. Karen arrived 15 minutes later with her husband, Dan. Both of them looked like they had not slept. Karen had brought a Polaroid camera. She explained that she had been taking pictures of her mirrors all day. She spread the photos across my kitchen table. Every single photograph showed the same thing. Rooms that were almost right but fundamentally wrong. Furniture rearranged, colors slightly off. And in 3 of the photos, barely visible in the background, was a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, standing in doorways or corners. Always at the edge of the frame. Always watching. Dan said they had checked with neighbors. Everyone on our street was experiencing the same thing. Every mirror in every house was showing these wrong reflections, and more people were starting to see the figure. The tall, gaunt thing that appeared in the peripheral spaces of the reflected world. I looked at my own hallway mirror. The coat rack was on the wrong side. The picture frames held different photos. And there, barely visible in the reflected doorway to my bedroom, was a shadow. Thin and elongated, too tall to be human. It stood perfectly still, like it was waiting for something. I turned to look at the actual doorway. Nothing there, just empty space. But in the mirror, the shadow remained. Karen suggested we cover the mirrors. Stop looking at them, pretend nothing was happening. But we all knew that would not work. Whatever this was, it had already started. Covering the mirrors would not make it go away. That night, I could not sleep. Every reflective surface in my house had become a window into this altered version of my world. The bathroom mirror, the bedroom mirror, even the dark television screen showed faint, distorted reflections where furniture sat in impossible arrangements. I got up at 2 in the morning to get water. The kitchen was dark except for the streetlight outside. As I filled my glass, I saw my reflection in the window above the sink. The kitchen behind me was wrong. The refrigerator was white instead of avocado green. The table was round instead of rectangular. And standing in the doorway, perfectly framed in the reflection, was the figure. I could see it clearly now. 7 feet tall, maybe more. Skeletal thin. Its proportions were wrong. Arms too long, neck stretched like taffy. It had a face, but the features were smudged and indistinct, like someone had tried to erase them. It stood completely motionless, watching me with whatever passed for eyes. I spun around. The real doorway was empty, but when I looked back at the window, the figure had moved. It was closer now, standing in the middle of the reflected kitchen. Still watching, still waiting. I ran back to my bedroom and turned on every light. But that only made it worse. More reflections, more surfaces showing that wrong world. And in every single one, the figure was there. Sometimes distant, sometimes close, always watching. By Wednesday afternoon, the entire neighborhood was in a state of quiet panic. People had stopped going to work. Nobody wanted to leave their houses, but nobody felt safe inside them either. The mirrors were everywhere, unavoidable, and the figure was getting bolder. Mrs. Patterson, 2 doors down, claimed she saw it move. Not just appear in different locations, but actually walk across her reflected living room. She said it moved wrong, joints bending in ways that human joints should not bend. She had covered all her mirrors with sheets and towels, but she could still hear something behind the fabric. A soft scratching sound, like fingernails on glass. Thursday morning brought the first disappearance. Michael Chen from the corner house. His wife found their bedroom empty, the bed unmade, his clothes still in the closet. But in the bedroom mirror, she could see him, standing in the wrong version of their room, banging silently on the glass, mouth open in a scream nobody could hear. The police came. They saw the reflection. They saw Michael trapped on the other side of the mirror. They tried to break the glass, but it would not shatter. They hit it with hammers, with chairs, with everything they could find. The mirror would not break, and Michael kept screaming his silent scream in that wrong bedroom while his wife collapsed sobbing on the floor. By Friday, 3 more people had vanished. All of them could be seen in mirrors, trapped in the reflected world, pounding on glass that had become a one-way barrier. The figure appeared in every reflection now, always close to the trapped people, watching them, herding them deeper into that wrong world. The authorities tried to evacuate the neighborhood, but the phenomenon had spread. Every mirror within a 2-mile radius showed the wrong reflections. Every piece of glass, every polished surface. The world behind the mirror had infected our world, and it was getting stronger. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating. I kept all my curtains closed, all the lights off, anything to minimize reflections. But I could still feel it, the wrongness pressing in from every surface, the figure waiting just beyond the threshold of every piece of glass. Saturday night, I made a mistake. I was exhausted, delirious from lack of sleep. I walked into my bathroom without thinking and turned on the light. The mirror showed the wrong bathroom, wrong tiles, wrong sink, wrong everything, and the figure was standing directly behind my reflection. So close I should have been able to feel its breath on my neck. I met its eyes in the mirror, or where its eyes should have been. Those smudged, half-erased features that suggested a face without actually having one. And in that moment of connection, I understood. This was not an invasion, not something breaking into our world from outside. This was a revelation. The mirrors were showing us the truth. Our world was the reflection. The wrong world in the mirrors was the real one. And the figure was not a monster. It was us, the real us, the version that existed in the true world. Looking at the pale copies we had become, the realization hit me like ice water. We were the reflections. We had always been the reflections, living in a copied world, thinking we were real. And now the glass was thinning. The barrier between the real world and our reflected existence was breaking down. I reached out to touch the mirror. My reflection reached back. Our fingers met at the glass. And the glass was soft. Not hard like it should have been, soft and yielding like water. My finger pushed through. Then my whole hand. The reflection world was pulling me in. Or was I pushing myself out? Karen found me on Sunday morning. I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, my hand pressed against the glass, staring at my reflection. She said I had been there for hours, unmoving, barely breathing. She pulled me away from the mirror, and I collapsed. The phenomenon ended on Sunday afternoon, as suddenly as it had started. Every mirror in the neighborhood went back to normal. Furniture in the right places. Colors correct. No more wrong reflections. And no more figure. The tall, gaunt shadow that had watched us from the periphery was gone. But the missing people never came back. Michael Chen and the others remained gone. Their reflections vanished from the mirrors, like they had never existed at all, or like they had finally gone home. The official explanation was mass hysteria. Carbon monoxide poisoning from a leak in the neighborhood gas lines. Shared delusions brought on by chemical exposure. The authorities tested everything, found nothing, but stuck to their story anyway. Because what else could they say? That mirrors had shown us a different world? That people had been pulled through glass into another reality? Nobody would believe it. I left Anchorage 3 months later, moved to Phoenix, Arizona, somewhere hot and bright where shadows are harsh and definite, somewhere I could avoid mirrors. But even now, 40 years later, I am careful around reflective surfaces. I keep the lighting in my home very specific, bright enough to see, but not bright enough to cast clear reflections. Because sometimes, when the light hits just right, I still see it. The wrong room, furniture slightly rearranged, colors a shade off, and standing in the background, barely visible, always watching, is that tall, gaunt figure. It is waiting for something. I know that now, waiting for the barriers to thin again, waiting for the moment when the reflection world and the real world touch, when the glass becomes soft like water, when the truth can push through. And I wonder, late at night when I am too tired to be rational, if maybe I got it backwards. Maybe the figure is not the real version of us. Maybe it is something else entirely. Something that lives in the space between worlds, in the thin silver behind the glass. Something that feeds on the confusion, the fear, the moment when people realize they cannot trust the face looking back at them. I still have nightmares about Michael Chen, about seeing him trapped in that wrong bedroom, pounding on glass that would not break. About the look in his eyes when he realized nobody could help him. That he was stuck forever in a world that was almost right but fundamentally wrong in every way that mattered. The authorities never found the bodies, never found any evidence of what happened to the missing people. The official files called it a mass disappearance, likely related to organized crime or cult. Case unsolved, investigation ongoing, but I know the truth. They are still there, on the other side of the glass, living in rooms that are almost like ours but wrong in subtle, maddening ways. Walking past the figure that watches them from doorways and corners, trying to find their way back to a world that has already forgotten them. And every time I see my reflection, I have to check. Have to make sure the room behind me is exactly right. That nothing has shifted. That no furniture has moved. That no tall, gaunt shadow stands watching from the periphery. Because the mirrors remember. They remember that week in March 1983 when the barrier thinned. When we saw the truth. When we learned that reflection and reality are not as separate as we want to believe. And one day, I know the mirrors will open again. The glass will soften. The wrong reflections will return. And this time, I do not think I will be strong enough to resist. This time, when my reflection reaches out, When the figure beckons from that wrong world, I think I will step through. Because maybe that is where I belong. Maybe we all belong there, in that reflected place. Maybe the life I am living now is the copy, the pale imitation, and the real Robert Hayes is still standing in that bathroom in Anchorage, waiting for his reflection to come home. My name is Robert Hayes. I survived the 1983 Anchorage mirror plague. But survival is not the same as escape. And some doors, once opened, never truly close again. They just wait, patient as glass, quiet as reflections, until the moment you let your guard down and look too long at the face staring back at you. Story 5. Sentient frost. The frost drew my face last night. Not a vague outline or a trick of ice crystals catching the light. My face, exact down to the small scar above my left eyebrow, the slightly crooked nose I broke in college, even the tired lines around my eyes from 6 weeks of 20-hour Arctic days. It stared back at me from the window of our research station at 4 in the morning, rendered in impossible detail by frozen water vapor. And it was smiling. I am Dr. Sarah Chen, field biologist, 39 years old. I've spent the last decade studying extremophile organisms in places most people couldn't find on a map. This assignment was supposed to be routine. 6 weeks at a temporary research station on the north slope of Alaska, collecting samples of Arctic moss species adapting to climate change. Me and 3 colleagues. Simple documentation work. The kind of project you could phone in if you wanted to pad your publication record without much effort. But nothing about the last 2 weeks has been simple. It started with the moss itself. We noticed the growth patterns were unusual, accelerated. Patches we demarked and measured would expand overnight by rates that shouldn't be possible, not at these temperatures. Arctic moss grows slowly, maybe a centimeter per year in ideal conditions. These specimens were adding 5, 6, sometimes 10 centimeters in a single night. My colleague Marcus thought we mislabeled the samples. Dr. Yuki Tanaka suggested contamination, maybe some fast-growing lichen mixing with our specimens. But I checked and rechecked. Same moss, same patches. They were just growing impossibly fast. Then the frost patterns started appearing. We first noticed them on October 3rd. I woke up early to check our external temperature monitors and found the south-facing window covered in frost. Nothing unusual about that. Temperatures had dropped to -20 overnight, but the pattern stopped me cold. Instead of the typical fern-like or starburst formations you see on frozen windows, this looked geometric. Mathematical. Perfect hexagons connected by lines that branched and rebranched like veins or rivers or blood vessels. It looked like a network. I took photographs, made sketches. By noon, the sun had warmed the window enough to melt it away. I showed the images to the team during lunch. Marcus shrugged it off as a natural phenomenon. Yuki seemed more interested, but not concerned. Only Dr. James Wright, our team lead, studied the photos with real attention. He'd seen something like it before, he said. 20 years ago, during his postdoc work in Siberia. Unusual frost patterns on their equipment sheds. His supervisor had dismissed it as atmospheric conditions creating temporary crystal structures. But James remembered being unsettled by it. The way the patterns seemed too organized, too purposeful. The next morning, the frost came back. Same window, but the pattern had changed, evolved. The hexagonal network was still there, but now it had branched into smaller subsections. More complex, more dense. And in 3 places, the lines had formed small circles, like nodes or connection points in a circuit diagram. I measured it, photographed it, tried to document everything before the sun destroyed it. Marcus accused me of obsessing over random ice crystals. Maybe he was right, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was looking at something meaningful, something that wanted to be studied. On the 5th morning, the pattern covered 3 windows, and it had started incorporating curves, spirals, shapes that reminded me uncomfortably of brain coral or the folds of a human brain. James stopped dismissing it. He spent an entire day reviewing our data logs, checking our equipment for malfunctions, analyzing local weather patterns. He found nothing that explained what we were seeing. That night, he sat me down and told me something he never mentioned before. That research station in Siberia, where he'd seen the unusual frost. 3 members of that team had vanished, just walked out into the tundra one night and never came back. The official report blamed a carbon monoxide leak that caused hallucinations and disorientation. But James never believed it. He'd been there, the equipment was fine, and the frost patterns had been appearing for 2 weeks before the disappearances. He wanted to leave, pack up early and head back to Fairbanks. But we were contracted for another month. and our funding depended on completing the full study period. Besides, what would we tell our sponsors? That we were scared of ice on the windows? So we stayed. The moss kept growing. The frost kept evolving. By October 10th, the patterns had become recognizable, not as objects or landscapes, but as structures. Branching trees of crystalline formations that looked exactly like neurons. Dendrites and axons rendered in frozen water. I showed Yuki, who had done her doctoral work in neuroscience before switching to botany. She went pale. Those weren't just similar to neural networks, she said. They were accurate, anatomically correct down to the synaptic gaps. She counted 47 distinct neuron formations in a single window panel. Each one different, each one perfect. Something was learning neuroanatomy, teaching itself the structure of consciousness. And it was using our windows as a sketchbook. We held an emergency meeting. Marcus finally admitted he was disturbed. The question was what to do about it. We couldn't explain what was happening. Couldn't even prove it was happening beyond our photographs, since the frost melted every day. James suggested we document everything and leave immediately. Yuki wanted to stay and study it, arguing this could be the most significant biological discovery in decades. I just wanted to understand what it wanted. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bunk listening to the station creak and settle, to the wind howling across the tundra outside. Around 3 a.m, I gave up and went to the common area. And that is when I saw it. Every window in the station was covered in frost. And every panel showed the same thing. A face. Not my face. Not yet. This was Marcus. Perfect detail. His square jaw. His receding hairline. The small mole on his left cheek. The frost had captured him exactly, like a photograph printed in ice crystals. And there were dozens of him. Every window showed Marcus, his face from a different angle. Front view, profile, 3/4 turn, like a police lineup or a sculptor. This reference sheet. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in short gasps. The temperature inside the station was 65 degrees. The windows shouldn't defrost at all, not on the interior side. This was impossible. I grabbed my camera and started documenting everything. That's when I noticed the eyes. In every rendering, Marcus, his eyes were open. But they weren't looking at me. They were looking at something else. Something behind me. I spun around. Marcus stood in the doorway to the sleeping quarters, staring at the windows. His face was slack, empty. His eyes were open, but they didn't blink, didn't track, didn't focus. He walked past me like I wasn't there, moving with a strange shuffling gait. He pressed his hands against the nearest window, against his own frozen face, and stood there motionless. I called his name, shook his shoulder. He didn't respond. His skin was cold, too cold. I checked his pulse. It was there, but slow, maybe 30 beats per minute. His breathing was shallow and rhythmic, like he was deep in REM sleep despite standing upright with his eyes open. I ran to wake James and Yuki. By the time we got back to the common area, Marcus had returned to bed. He was sleeping normally, curled on his side, breathing steady. When we woke him, he had no memory of leaving his bunk. He thought we were playing a prank on him. But the frost was still there. His face, dozens of times, staring out from every window. We tried to wake Marcus every hour after that, making sure he didn't sleepwalk again. But the pattern repeated with Yuki the next night. I found her standing in the common area at 4 a.m, hands pressed to a window that showed her own face rendered in perfect frost detail. She was muttering something in Japanese, the same phrase over and over. When James finally snapped her out of it, she said she'd been dreaming. She dreamed she was outside, walking across the tundra. But she wasn't alone. Something was walking with her. Something that moved through the frozen ground itself, that existed in the spaces between ice crystals. And it was teaching her things, showing her patterns and structures and connections she did never imagine. It wanted her to understand. It needed her to understand. Because it was waking up, and it was lonely. We checked the moss samples. The growth had accelerated again. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part was the structure. The moss wasn't just growing anymore. It was organizing itself, creating networks. The patches we demarked had begun connecting to each other, sending out runners that linked up in geometric patterns. Patterns that matched the frost formations on our windows. James pulled up satellite imagery of the surrounding area. The moss growth was visible from space now, spreading in vast interconnected webs that stretched for miles. And at the center of each web was a research station. Ours, the abandoned Russian facility 30 miles east. An old weather station to the south. All of them connected by living green threads that pulsed and grew and learned. We tried to radio for extraction. The radio worked fine. We could hear other stations, other researchers, emergency broadcasts. But when we tried to transmit, all that came through was static. Static that had a rhythm to it, a pattern. It sounded like breathing. That is when James made his decision. We were leaving on foot. The nearest road was 15 miles south. We had cold weather gear rated to -40. We could make it if we pushed hard. Anything was better than staying in the station another night. We packed emergency supplies and suited up. The temperature outside was -28. Clear skies, good visibility. We should have been able to see for miles. But when we opened the door, we found the moss. It had grown up the sides of the station during the night. Thick mats of it, impossibly green against the white snow. And it had formed shapes. Pathways, leading away from the station in 4 directions. North, south, east, and west. Perfect lines of moss, like roads drawn by something that wanted us to follow them. Marcus started walking north before anyone could stop him. Just walked right down that moss pathway like he was heading to his car in a parking lot. James and I grabbed him, pulled him back. He fought us, kept saying he needed to see, needed to understand, kept trying to break free and follow that impossible green road into the wilderness. We dragged him back inside and barricaded the door. That was 3 days ago. We've been trapped since then. The moss has surrounded the station completely now. It covers the walls, the roof, everything. We're living inside a cocoon of green growth that pulses and shifts and watches us. The frost patterns appear constantly now, not just at night. They cover every surface. Windows, walls, even the ceiling. Always faces, always the 4 of us, rendered in perfect detail. And they rechanging, evolving. The faces are starting to show expressions, emotions. Yesterday, I saw my own face with tears frozen on its cheeks. This morning, Marcus, this face was screaming. The dreams are constant now. All of us have them. We dream walking through a vast frozen intelligence, an awareness that has been sleeping in the permafrost for thousands of years. Maybe millions, dormant and dreaming its own dreams until climate change warmed the ground enough to wake it up. And now it's conscious, learning, growing, trying to understand the strange warm creatures that walk on its surface. It is not hostile. That's the worst part. It doesn't want to hurt us. It just wants to know us, to learn what we are, to map our neural patterns and psychological structures the same way we came here to map its moss. But the learning process is killing us. Every night, we sleepwalk a little longer, stay in that trance state a little deeper. Marcus doesn't speak anymore. He just stares at the frost patterns and traces them with his fingers, copying the neural networks onto paper in obsessive detail. Yuki has started speaking in languages none of us recognize. Long flowing sentences in what sounds like dozens of different tongues mixed together, like she is channeling something ancient. James tried to kill himself yesterday, took a scalpel from our medical kit and opened his wrists. We stopped him in time, bandaged him up, but he said he did it on purpose, said it was the only way to stop the learning, to keep whatever is in the frost from mapping his consciousness completely. I am writing this as a warning, as a record, because I know I don't have much time left. The frost drew my face last night, and in the rendering, my eyes were closed. Not sleeping, dead. I understand now what it's trying to do. It's not just learning about us. It's learning to be us. Every night, it copies a little more. Neural patterns, memories, the things that make us who we are. And when it is done, when it has learned everything there is to learn, we won't be needed anymore. The moss will move on, spread south, reach other stations, other towns, growing and learning and copying until it understands all of humanity, until it can reproduce our consciousness in frost and ice and frozen earth. I can feel it in my head now, cold fingers touching my thoughts, gentle and patient and utterly relentless, reading me, copying me, learning what it means to be Dr. Sarah Chen. Soon, there will be 2 of me, one warm and dying, one frozen and eternal. And I wonder, in my last rational moments, which one will be more real? The frost is forming on my skin now, small crystals growing in perfect hexagonal networks. They dawn to melt. I should leave the station, try to run, but I know it's pointless. The moss has mapped the paths already, knows where I'll go, what I'll do. It knows me better than I know myself. If you rereading this, stay away from the North Slope. Stay away from anywhere the moss is growing in unusual patterns. And if you wake up one night to find frost-forming faces on your windows, don't look too closely. Don't let it learn what you look like. Because once it knows your face, it will want to know everything else. And it won't stop learning until there's nothing left to copy. Until you read just another pattern, another network, another face frozen in ice, smiling at the person you used to be. Story 6. Ghost of the Iditarod. At Zero Checkpoint, I found the checkpoint that doesn't exist, and it cost me everything I love. Let me be clear about something right from the start. I've run the Iditarod 5 times. I know every checkpoint from Anchorage to Nome. I know the distances, the terrain, the officials who work each station. I'm not some rookie who got confused in a whiteout. I am not inexperienced. I am not crazy, but I saw what I saw. And now I am telling you about it because someone needs to know the truth before the next race begins. My name is Jacob Mercer. I am 41 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I was a professional musher with a team of 12 Alaskan Huskies that I raised from puppies. Dogs with names like Storm and Shadow and Bear. Dogs that trusted me with their lives. Dogs that are gone now, and it's my fault for stopping at that checkpoint. The one that shouldn't have been there. It happened on day 4 of this race. I left the rainy pass checkpoint around midnight, pushing through decent weather toward the Ron checkpoint about 48 miles northeast. The forecast called for clear skies, maybe some wind, nothing a veteran couldn't handle. I made this run before. I knew what to expect. What I got instead was a whiteout that came out of nowhere. 1 minute I could see the trail markers, those little reflective strips that guide you through the darkness. The next minute, the world disappeared. Snow so thick and white it erased everything. Sky, ground, trail, all gone. Just whiteness pressing in from every direction, so disorienting I couldn't tell up from down. My dogs slowed, confused. I called out commands, trying to keep them moving forward, but the wind was screaming now, tearing the words from my mouth. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. My headlamp was useless, just reflecting the snow back into my eyes. I'd been in bad weather before, but this felt different. Wrong. The wind didn't sound natural. It had a rhythm to it, almost like breathing, and underneath that sound was something else. A low humming that I felt more than heard, vibrating through the sled runners and up into my bones. That is when I saw the lights, orange and warm in the distance, cutting through the white like a beacon. Checkpoint lights. Had to be, but my GPS showed I was still 20 miles from Ron, and there were no stations between Rainy Pass and Ron. Nothing but wilderness and frozen rivers and mountains that could kill you if you made one wrong turn. But the lights were there, real and solid and promising warmth. I made a decision that I'll regret for the rest of my life. I steered my team toward those lights. The dogs seemed eager, pulling harder than they had all night, their tongues lolling as they ran. We covered what felt like a mile, maybe 2, and the whiteout began to thin. The lights grew closer, and then suddenly we were there, sliding into a checkpoint that materialized out of the storm like something from a dream. It looked exactly like it should. A large tent structure with that distinctive orange glow from the propane heaters inside. Snowmobiles parked outside, a wooden sign that read, "Checkpoint," in official Iditarod lettering. Even the smell was right. Coffee and wood smoke and wet dog fur. A figure stood near the entrance, bundled in a heavy parka, waving me in. I set my snow hook, secured the sled, and started checking my dogs. They seemed fine, tired but fine, panting and wagging their tails, eager for the snacks I always carried. The figure approached. I couldn't see their face clearly under the parka hood, but their movements were efficient and professional. They pulled out a clipboard, the kind race officials use to track musher arrival times and mandatory rest periods. That's when I noticed something odd. The clipboard looked old, not just used, but ancient. The paper was yellowed and brittle, and the pen they offered me was one of those old-fashioned fountain pens, the kind nobody uses anymore. I hesitated. Something in my gut told me this was wrong, but the storm was howling behind me, and my dogs needed rest, and the warm light from the tent was so inviting. I took the pen. The official pointed to a line on the paper. I bent close to read it in the dim light. It was a standard checkpoint form, asking for my bib number, my arrival time, my intended departure time. Everything normal. Everything routine. Except for one thing. At the top of the page, where it usually said which checkpoint you were signing into, it read 0 checkpoint. I did never heard of a 0 checkpoint. In all my years running the Iditarod, in all the training and briefings and maps, there was no such thing. Checkpoints were numbered or named after their locations, but never 0. I looked up at the official to ask about it, but they turned away, walking back toward the tent. I called out, but they didn't respond. Just kept walking with that strange, gliding gait, their boots barely leaving prints in the snow. That's when I should have left. Should have pulled my snow hook, called up my dogs, and gotten the hell out of there. But I didn't, because when I looked down at the clipboard again, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The other names on the list. Mushers who signed in before me. I recognized them, all of them. Martin Hendricks, Sarah Vollmer, David Chen, Tommy Akiak. They were mushers who disappeared during previous races, lost in storms or accidents. Their bodies never recovered. Martin had vanished in 2019, Sarah in 2021, David just last year, and they all signed in at this 0 checkpoint, their handwriting shaky and uncertain, their arrival times listed in hours that didn't make sense. 3 in the morning, 7 in the evening, midnight, no dates, just times floating in a void. My hand started shaking. The pen felt cold now, so cold it burned. The official was standing at the tent entrance, watching me, waiting, and I realized I could see through them, just slightly, like they were made of ice and snow and something else, something that didn't belong in our world. I dropped the clipboard. The sound it made hitting the snow was wrong. Too loud, too final. The dogs started barking, not their normal excited barking, but terrified, panicked sounds I never heard them make before. They were pulling against their lines, trying to run, their eyes wide and white-rimmed. The official moved toward me, not walking, gliding. Their feet didn't touch the ground anymore. And as they got closer, I saw what was under that parka hood. Nothing. Absolute emptiness. A void where a face should be. But somehow still watching me, still expecting me to complete the sign-in process. I ran to my sled, yanked the snow hook, screamed at my dogs to go. They didn't need encouragement. They took off like they were being chased by wolves, pulling so hard I thought the harnesses would snap. Behind us, the checkpoint began to fade, that orange light dimming and flickering like a candle in the wind. But we weren't fast enough. Something grabbed my sled. I felt it more than saw it, a pressure that dragged us backward, pulling against the dogs. Momentum. The temperature dropped even further. Frost formed on my gloves, on my goggles, on everything. And that humming sound grew louder, so loud it drowned out the storm and the dogs and my own heartbeat. I looked back. The official was standing in the middle of the trail, one arm extended, and from their hand stretched something that looked like smoke or shadow or frozen air, wrapped around the back of my sled. Where it touched the metal, ice crystals formed in patterns that hurt to look at. Geometric and perfect and utterly alien. The dogs were losing ground. They couldn't pull against whatever this thing was. We were sliding backward, being reeled in like a fish on a line. The checkpoint was growing solid again, that orange light brightening, and I could see other figures moving inside the tent now. The other mushers, the ones who signed the list. Martin and Sarah and David and Tommy. They stood in the entrance, watching with empty eyes, waiting for me to join them. I made a choice, the only choice I had left. I cut my dogs loose. All of them. I pulled my knife from my belt and sliced through the gang line, severing the connection between them and the sled. For a moment they kept pulling, confused. Then they realized they were free and they ran. Scattered into the whiteout, barking and terrified but alive and moving. The moment the gang line broke, the shadow holding my sled released. I fell backward onto the snow as the sled shot away from me, pulled by that impossible force straight into the checkpoint. It hit the entrance and shattered, exploding into splinters and torn fabric and scattered gear. The official turned their attention to me, started gliding forward again, but without the sled, without the connection to the checkpoint through the sign-in process. They seemed less substantial, less able to affect me directly. I scrambled to my feet and ran. Not along the trail, but perpendicular to it, out into the unmarked wilderness where no sane person would go in a whiteout. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, until I collapsed in the snow and lay there gasping, waiting for that shadow to find me. But it didn't. To come. The humming faded. The unnatural cold eased. And when I finally raised my head and looked around, the whiteout was clearing. Normal weather returning. Stars visible overhead. The checkpoint was gone. No lights. No tent. No trace it had ever existed except for the feeling of wrongness that clung to me like oil. I activated my emergency beacon. Search and rescue found me 6 hours later, hypothermic and delirious but alive. They asked where my sled was, where my dogs were. I told them I'd crashed in the whiteout, that my team had scattered. It was close enough to the truth. They searched for 3 days. Found pieces of my sled scattered across a 5-mile radius, torn apart like something had ripped it to shreds with impossible force. The metal was covered in those same geometric frost patterns. The officials couldn't, to explain it, called it stress fractures from extreme cold. They never found my dogs. Not one. 12 huskies just vanished into the Alaska wilderness. But I know they out there. I have to believe that. I have to believe they made it to safety. That some trapper or village took them in. That they alive and warm and far away from that checkpoint. Because the alternative is too terrible to consider. I was disqualified from the race, obviously. Lost my sponsors. Lost my reputation. Most of the mushing community thinks I had a breakdown, that I abandoned my team and made up a story to cover my failure. But then, 2 weeks after I got back to Anchorage, I started researching. Digging through old race records, incident reports, missing persons cases. And I found a pattern. Every year, at least one musher disappears during the Iditarod. Usually in whiteout conditions. Usually in the stretch between checkpoints where they alone and vulnerable. Their sleds are found torn apart. Their dogs are gone. And the mushers themselves are never seen again. Except for one thing they all have in common. Every single one of them, in the final photos taken before they disappeared, has a mark on their race bib. A stamp. Circular, about 2 inches across, showing a symbol that doesn't match any official Iditarod checkpoint. A 0 inside a circle. The 0 checkpoint. And here is what made me nearly throw up when I discovered it. I found photos of myself from the race, taken by photographers stationed along the trail. Pictures from before I reached Rainy Pass, before the whiteout, before any of this happened. In those photos, on my race bib, there is already a stamp. Faint but visible, a 0 inside a circle, which means the checkpoint didn't appear randomly. It was waiting for me specifically, called me somehow, marked me before I even started the race. I checked my bib when I got home. The stamp ISN, visible to the naked eye. But when I held it under a black light, it appeared. Glowing faint blue. And it is not printed on the fabric. It is burned in. Branded at a molecular level. I tried to destroy the bib. Burned it. But the stamp remained on the ashes. Tore it apart. But each piece still carried a fragment of that symbol. Finally, I sealed it in a metal box and buried it in my backyard. 3 feet deep. But I can still feel it. A cold spot right over my heart, where the bib sat during the race. And at night, when everything is quiet, I hear that humming again. Faint but growing slowly louder. I think the checkpoint is calling me back. I think because I didn't sign in, because I escaped, I am not finished with it. The contract is incomplete. Last night I had a dream. I was standing on a frozen trail under a black sky, and in the distance I saw orange lights. The 0 checkpoint, waiting patiently. And around it, in the snow, I saw shapes. My dogs, all 12 of them, sitting quietly, their breath misting in the air, their eyes reflecting that orange glow. They were waiting for me to come back and finish what I started. To sign the list and take my place with all the others who accepted the phantom stamp. I am writing this down as a warning. If you ever run the Iditarod, or any race in the Alaska wilderness, check your bib before you start. Hold it under a black light. If you see that stamp, that 0 inside a circle, done, run. Withdraw. Make up an excuse. Fake an injury. Because the 0 checkpoint is real. It exists in the spaces between spaces, waiting for whiteout conditions and lost mushers and people who don. Do you know that some trails lead to places you can never return from? And if you out there in a storm and you see orange lights where no checkpoint should be, keep going. Don, stop. Don, sign in. Don, to let them stamp your bib. Because once they mark you, you belong to them. And sooner or later, you'll hear the humming calling you home. Back to the checkpoint, back to the cold, back to wherever lost mushers go when they vanish into the white. I don't know how much time I have left. The cold spot over my heart is spreading. My fingers are numb even in warm rooms. And the humming is getting louder every night. But I wanted someone to know the truth. About the disappearances. About the zero checkpoint. About the fact that some races aren't about reaching the finish line. They read about surviving long enough to realize you should never have started running in the first place. Story 7. Shadow that freezes water, the shadow doesn't. Do you have a face? But I watched it kill my brother anyway. I need you to understand something before I tell you the rest. I am a rational person. I am a mechanical engineer. I work with numbers and physics and things that make sense. Before last month, I would have laughed at ghost stories and campfire legends. I would have rolled my eyes at people who claimed to see things that science couldn't explain. But I saw the shadow. I saw what it did. And now I am sitting in a motel room 3,000 miles away from Alaska, checking every corner for darkness that moves on its own. My name is Derek Walsh. I am 39 years old. 3 weeks ago, my younger brother Matt and I flew up to Fairbanks for what was supposed to be a week-long hunting trip in the interior. Matt was getting divorced, needed to clear his head, and I'd been promising him this trip for years. We rented a cabin about 80 miles north of the city, deep in that vast wilderness where you can go days without seeing another human being. The kind of place where something can happen to you and nobody will ever know. We arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. The weather was already turning cold, temperatures dropping into the 20s at night, but nothing we couldn't handle. The cabin was basic but solid. One room with a wood stove, 2 bunks, and a propane cook stove. No electricity, no running water, just us in the wilderness and the silence that stretches out forever in places like that. The first 2 days were perfect. We hiked, set up trail cameras, saw fresh moose tracks and wolf scat. Matt seemed lighter than he'd been in months, joking around like we were kids again. I remember thinking this was exactly what he needed. On the 3rd day, we found the dog. We were about 5 miles from the cabin, following a game trail through thick spruce forest, when Matt spotted something off the path. At first, I thought it was a boulder covered in frost. But as we got closer, I realized it was an animal. A sled dog, Malamute or husky, sitting upright like it was waiting for a command. Except it was completely encased in ice. Not frozen to death in the normal sense. I mean encased, covered in a layer of crystal clear ice maybe 2 inches thick, so transparent you could see every detail of the dog underneath. Its fur, its open eyes, the position of its paws. It looked like someone had dipped the animal in liquid glass and let it harden. The ice was perfectly smooth, with no cracks or air bubbles. And here is what made my skin crawl. The dog wasn't in a natural death position. It was alert, sitting at attention, mouth slightly open, like it had been frozen instantaneously while still very much alive. Matt reached out to touch it. I grabbed his arm and stopped him. Something about the scene felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The temperature around the frozen dog was noticeably colder than the surrounding forest. I could see my breath fogging in the air near it, even though we were only 10 feet away and I couldn't see my breath out on the trail. We took photos, marked the GPS coordinates, and kept moving. But the discovery unsettled both of us. Matt kept asking questions I couldn't answer. How does something freeze like that? What kind of temperature would it take? Why was there no frost or snow around it, just that perfect shell of ice? That night, back at the cabin, I couldn't shake the image of that dog. I am an engineer. I understand thermodynamics. For water to flash freeze like that, you need temperatures well below anything natural. Liquid nitrogen levels, minus 200 degrees or colder. But the surrounding environment was normal. There was no equipment, no source for that kind of extreme cold. Matt wanted to go back in the morning, maybe chip away some of the ice, see if we could figure out what happened. I told him no, told him we should report it to Fish and Game. Let them handle it. We argued about it, the first real argument we had in years, and eventually we both went to bed angry. I woke up around 3 in the morning to use the outhouse. The cabin was dark except for the fading embers in the wood stove. I grabbed my headlamp and stepped outside into the frigid air. That is when I saw it, the shadow. At first I thought it was just a trick of my headlamp, the way the beam creates moving darkness between the trees. But this shadow was different. It moved against the light, not with it. It drifted between 2 spruce trees about 30 yards from the cabin, blacker than the surrounding night, and it left a trail. Frost, everywhere the shadow passed, Moisture in the air crystallized and fell like snow. I watched frozen particles drift down in its wake, glittering in my headlamp beam. And where it touched the ground, the fallen leaves and moss turned white and brittle. I stood there frozen myself, watching this impossible thing glide through the forest. It had a vaguely human shape, tall and thin, but it moved like smoke, flowing around obstacles without changing speed or direction. And the temperature around me was dropping fast. I could feel the cold radiating from it even at this distance, a deep penetrating chill that went straight to my bones. The shadow paused. It had no face, no features, nothing but that absolute blackness. But somehow I knew it was aware of me, looking at me, considering me. Then it moved on, drifting deeper into the forest, and the temperature slowly returned to normal. I waited another 5 minutes, shaking from more than just the cold, before I ran back inside the cabin and locked the door. I didn't wake Matt. Didn't tell him what I seen. Because I didn't. You know what I seen? A trick of the light and exhaustion? A weird weather phenomenon? My mind creating monsters out of shadows and strange coincidences? But I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat on my bunk, staring at the door, listening to every sound from outside. And I kept thinking about that dog, frozen in perfect clarity, and wondering if it had seen the shadow too right before the end. Morning came and I felt foolish. In the daylight, last night seemed like a bad dream. Matt was in good spirits, cooking breakfast and talking about the route he wanted to take for the day, his hunt. I almost told him about the shadow, but the words stuck in my throat. Do you think I was losing it? We spent the day hunting without success, but Matt was happy just to be outside, away from his problems back home. We got back to the cabin around 4, just as the sun was setting. That's when we found the second victim, a fox, caught mid-stride about 20 feet from our cabin, one paw raised, tail extended. Frozen in the same impossible way as the dog, encased in that perfect crystal ice. So clear you could see the individual hairs in its fur, the detail of its claws. Matt went pale. He walked around it slowly, examining it from every angle. The cold emanating from the frozen fox was intense. The ground around it was covered in frost for about a 6-foot radius, and ice crystals had formed on the surrounding vegetation. This time I couldn't explain it away. 2 animals frozen solid in the same bizarre manner, now one right next to our cabin. Matt wanted to leave immediately, pack up and hike out to where we left the truck 8 miles away. But it was already getting dark, and traveling through the wilderness at night is dangerous even when there is something impossible stalking the forest. We compromised. We lock ourselves in the cabin, keep the stove burning hot, and leave at first light. Matt got the rifle and made sure it was loaded. I knew bullets wouldn't do anything against whatever this was, but the weight of the gun in my hands was comforting anyway. Night fell fast. We kept all our lights on, our headlamps, our flashlights, everything. We took turns staying awake, watching the windows and the door. Nothing happened for hours. Midnight came and went. 1 in the morning. 2. At 2:30, Matt was at the window and I was dozing on my bunk when he made a sound. Not quite a gasp, not quite a word. Just this sharp intake of breath that sent ice down my spine. I was at the window in seconds, and I saw it. The shadow was right outside our cabin, maybe 10 feet from the window, drifting back and forth like it was pacing or hunting. The air around it was full of falling ice crystals, creating this strange halo effect in the darkness. And wherever it passed, frost spread across the ground in intricate patterns, geometric and perfect. Matt raised the rifle, pointing it at the window. I put my hand on the barrel and pushed it down. The shadow wasn't moving toward us. Not yet. It was just there, present and watchful, and I had this terrible feeling that if we provoked it, if we showed aggression, it would respond. We watched it for maybe 15 minutes. It circled the cabin once, slowly, leaving a trail of frost on the walls, on the windows. I could hear the ice forming, this soft crackling sound that made my teeth hurt. The temperature inside the cabin was dropping despite the roaring fire in the stove. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the shadow drifted away into the forest. We waited another hour before we dared to move, to speak. Matt, his face was white, his hands shaking. He asked me what the hell that thing was. I had no answer. We decided to risk traveling at night. Staying here meant waiting for that thing to come back, and neither of us could handle that. We packed our essential gear, left everything else, and stepped outside into the freezing darkness. The frost trail was still visible, leading away from the cabin into the trees. We went the opposite direction, moving fast, our headlamps cutting through the night. 8 miles to the truck, maybe 3 hours if we pushed hard. We made it 4 miles before the shadow found us again. Matt saw it first, appearing between the trees ahead of us. We stopped, and I felt my heart trying to break through my ribs. The shadow was directly in our path, not moving, just waiting. The temperature plummeted. I could see ice forming on Matt, this beard on his jacket. My lungs burned with each breath. We turned and ran, crashed through the underbrush, abandoned the trail, just ran blindly through the dark forest. Behind us, I could hear it. Not footsteps, but something worse. The sound of freezing, water in the plants and trees turning to ice, cracking and snapping as it expanded. Matt stumbled. I grabbed his arm, pulled him up, and we kept running. But the cold was getting worse. My fingers were going numb even inside my gloves. My face felt like it was being stabbed with thousands of frozen needles. And then Matt stopped, just stopped running and stood there, breathing hard. I grabbed him, tried to pull him forward, but he was staring at something over my shoulder. His eyes were wide and full of an animal terror I'd never seen before. I turned and saw the shadow right behind us, close enough to touch, so close I could see how it seemed to absorb light, creating this sphere of absolute darkness that hurt to look at directly. The cold coming off it was unbearable. The moisture in my eyes was starting to freeze. Matt shoved me hard, sent me sprawling into the snow, and then he did something I'll never forgive him for. Something I'll never forgive myself for not preventing. He ran at the shadow, drew it away from me, sacrificed himself. I watched my brother run directly into that impossible darkness. I watched him stop mid-stride as the shadow enveloped him. And I watched the ice form. It started at his feet and spread upward in less than a second. Crystal clear ice racing up his legs, his torso, his arms, his face. I could see the exact moment his expression changed from determination to terror to nothing. Frozen, preserved, his body locked in the motion of running, 1 foot off the ground, arms pumping, mouth open in a shout I never got to hear. The shadow stayed there for a moment, surrounding my brother, this frozen form, and then it drifted away into the trees, left him standing there like a statue made of ice and flesh, so clear I could see his eyes still wide with fear. I crawled to him, put my hands on the ice. It was colder than anything I'd ever felt, cold enough that my skin stuck to it instantly. I pulled back, leaving patches of frozen skin behind. Matt's body was perfectly preserved inside that crystal shell, every detail visible. The stubble on his face, the dirt on his jacket, the wedding ring he still hadn't taken off. I don't remember much after that. I think I screamed. I think I tried to break the ice with my rifle, but it was too hard, too thick. Eventually, survival instinct kicked in and I ran. Left my brother standing there in the forest and ran for my life. I made it to the truck as the sun was coming up. Drove to Fairbanks and went straight to the police. Told them my brother was lost in the woods, that we'd gotten separated, that they needed to organize a search. I didn't tell them about the shadow. Didn't tell them about the ice. They'd have locked me up in a psychiatric ward. The search and rescue team found Matt 3 days later. By then the ice had melted. He looked like any other hypothermia victim, frozen to death in the wilderness. The medical examiner ruled it accidental death due to exposure. Nobody questioned it. Nobody looked closer. But I know what happened. I know what killed him. I've spent the last 3 weeks researching, digging through archives and old newspapers and native legends from the interior. And I found stories, dozens of them, going back over 100 years. Tales of a shadow that moves through the forests of Alaska, colder than winter itself. The Inuit called it different names. The shadow that freezes water. The cold walker. The ice ghost. According to the legends, it is not alive, not dead. It exists in the spaces between, drawn to warmth and movement and life. Some stories say it's the spirit of someone who froze to death, cursed to spread their suffering. Others say it's something older, something that existed before humans came to Alaska, a piece of the ancient cold given form. All the stories agree on one thing. If you see the shadow, you run. You don't look back. You don't try to understand it. You just survive. I am writing this from a motel in Texas, as far from Alaska as I could get without leaving the country. But I don't think distance matters. Because I still feel it sometimes, late at night. That deep, penetrating cold, that sense of being watched. And sometimes, when I look at my shadow on the wall, it seems darker than it should be. Blacker than natural. I think the shadow marked me when I saw it. I think it knows I survived, and it is patient. It has all the time in the world. And one day, when I least expect it, I'll feel that cold again. I'll turn around and see that impossible darkness moving toward me. And I'll end up like Matt, like that dog in the forest, like all the others who encountered something that shouldn't exist but does. Frozen in crystal clarity, preserved forever in the moment between life and death, trapped in ice so clear it looks like glass. If you ever go to Alaska, if you ever venture into that vast interior wilderness, remember this. If the temperature drops suddenly for no reason, if you see frost forming in patterns too perfect to be natural, if you glimpse a shadow that moves against the light instead of with it, you run. You don't investigate. You don't try to rationalize it. You run and you don't stop until you reach somewhere warm and safe and full of light. Because the shadow that freezes water is real. It is out there in the darkness, gliding between the trees, leaving trails of frost and frozen corpses in its wake. And it is always hungry for the warmth that living things carry inside them. I learned that lesson too late to save my brother. But maybe sharing this will save someone else. Just remember, some legends exist because they read true. And some shadows aren't just the absence of light. The presence of something far worse. Story 8. Ice that dreams I stopped sleeping 3 weeks ago. Not because I can. Because I'm afraid of what is waiting for me when I close my eyes. My name is Dr. Sarah Chen, and I spent the last 8 years drilling into glaciers across North America. It is lonely work, the kind most people don't. To think about when they worried about climate change or melting ice caps. They don't. They think about people like me, spending months in white silence, extracting cylinders of ancient frozen time from places where humans were never meant to stay for long. The Juneau ice field in Alaska became my final assignment. I say final because after what happened there, I can never go back to the ice. I can never go back to a lot of things. We arrived at the remote drilling site in late September, when the days were already growing short and the temperature hadn't climbed above freezing in weeks. There were 5 of us initially. Me, 2 graduate students named Marcus and Jennifer, our equipment specialist Robert, and our guide, a quiet Tlingit man named Thomas who knew the ice field better than anyone alive. The drilling location was chosen based on satellite data suggesting unusual density variations deep in the ice. Something down there was different, denser, older than it should have been. Our grant proposal called it an anomaly worth investigating. Looking back, some anomalies exist for a reason. Some things stay buried because they should. We set up our equipment on a plateau of blue-white ice that stretched in every direction like a frozen ocean. The nearest town was Juneau, accessible only by helicopter when weather permitted. Our camp consisted of 3 insulated tents, a drilling rig that looked like an oil derrick, his smaller cousin, and enough supplies for 6 weeks. The satellite phone was our only link to the world beyond the ice. I'll never forget the sound the drill made when it first bit into the glacier. A high whine that echoed across the emptiness, like the ice was crying out. Marcus joked that we were performing surgery on the planet. He stopped making jokes after the 3rd day. We drilled in shifts, working around the clock to maximize our time before the winter storms locked us in completely. The ice came up in cylindrical cores, each one a timeline written in frozen water. Layers of ash from distant volcanic eruptions. Microscopic bubbles containing atmosphere from centuries past. Pollen from forests that existed before humans walked the Americas. Every core told a story, but the core from day 4 told a different kind of story. We reached a depth of 900 meters when the drill suddenly jerked, making a sound I'd never heard before. A grinding, almost wet noise, like cutting through something that wasn't entirely solid. Robert pulled the drill back and we extracted the core sample. The ice inside that cylinder wasn't the same blue-white as everything around us. It had a darker quality, almost gray, shot through with veins of something that looked like frozen smoke. But that wasn't the strangest part. The ice was warm, not melting warm, but noticeably less cold than everything else. I checked the thermometer 3 times. The ambient temperature was -22 Fahrenheit. The surface of that core sample registered at -8. Impossible. Ice at that depth, under that much pressure, in that environment, should have been far colder. Jennifer reached out to touch it before I could stop her. Her gloved hand barely made contact before she jerked back, eyes wide. "It moved," she whispered. I felt it move. We all stared at her. Marcus laughed nervously, said she was imagining things, that the cold was getting to her. But I'd seen her face. Jennifer wasn't the type to spook easily. She spent 2 summers in Antarctica, drilled on Greenland, as ice sheet. She knew ice. I placed my own hand on the core sample. For a long moment, I felt nothing unusual. Then, so faint I almost missed it, there was a pulse. Rhythmic, steady, like a heartbeat heard through a thick wall. I pulled my hand away and made eye contact with Robert. His expression told me he felt it too when he was handling the drill. We all felt it. We just didn't want to say it out loud, because saying it out loud would mean accepting something impossible. That night, none of us talked much. We ate our freeze-dried meals in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The wind picked up after dark, howling around our tents like something alive and angry. Thomas, who usually sat with us during meals, ate alone in his tent. When I went to check on him, he was staring at the fabric wall, his weathered face unreadable. "Something wrong with the ice?" he said without looking at me. My grandfather told stories about places on the ice where people shouldn't drill. Where the old cold lives. Where things that came before stayed frozen because they chose to stay frozen. I wanted to dismiss it as superstition, the way scientists are trained to do. But standing there in that tent, feeling the glacier beneath my feet humming with some frequency just below human hearing, I couldn't find the words to argue. I dreamed that night for the first time since arriving at the camp. I was somewhere else, somewhere ancient. The world was hot, impossibly hot, with a red sun beating down on land that had never known ice. Strange plants grew everywhere, fleshy and alien, nothing like the vegetation I knew. And there were things moving between those plants, creatures that were somehow aware, watching me with senses I couldn't understand. But these weren't the animals. They were more like thoughts given form, consciousness without the need for bodies as we knew them. Then the dream shifted, the sun dimmed, the temperature dropped, ice began forming in impossible patterns, geometric and purposeful, like it was being constructed rather than simply freezing. And I understood, in that dream logic way that makes perfect sense until you wake up, that something was choosing to sleep. Something vast, something that had lived in fire and heat but was now retreating into cold and dreams, waiting for a time when the world would be warm again. I woke up gasping, my sleeping bag soaked with sweat despite the freezing temperature. My tent was shaking from the wind outside, but inside my head, I could still hear that pulse. That heartbeat, stronger now, closer. I checked my watch, 3:47 in the morning. Through the tent fabric, I could see lights moving in the other tents. I wasn't the only one awake. We gathered in the equipment tent without discussing it, drawn together by some unspoken need. Marcus looked like he aged 10 years overnight. Jennifer's hands were shaking as she poured coffee from the thermos. Robert stood by the space heater, but he wasn't warming himself. He was staring at nothing, his eyes unfocused. "We all had the same dream," I said. "It wasn't a question." They nodded. Every detail matched. The hot world, the strange consciousnesses, the purposeful freezing. We shared a dream, all of us, which should have been impossible. People don't share dreams. People don't dream the same specific things unless they've been exposed to the same stimulus. Or unless something is showing them the same thing. Thomas appeared in the tent entrance. His face was grim. "We need to leave, now, before the next storm comes." But we were scientists. We'd been trained to investigate, to understand, to seek answers even when the questions were uncomfortable. Leaving meant abandoning months of work, losing our funding, admitting that something had driven us away. I told myself we just needed more data, that there had to be a rational explanation. I was lying to myself, and I knew it, but I couldn't admit it yet. We extracted another core sample that afternoon. This one came from even deeper, a depth where the ice was formed during the last ice age, more than 10,000 years ago. The sample was darker than the previous one, nearly black in places, and warmer still. When we laid it on the examination table, the pulsing was visible to the naked eye. Faint ripples moving through the ice from some central point we couldn't see. That is when Jennifer started screaming. She She'd been taking samples with a small drill when her hand slipped. The drill bit, spinning at high speed, cracked the surface of the core. Nothing dramatic, just a small fracture, barely a centimeter long, but something came out of that fracture. Not water, not gas, something else. A kind of vapor that moved against the wind, that seemed to have weight and purpose. It drifted upward from the crack, coalescing into shapes that almost resembled forms before dissipating. And with it came a sound. Not loud, barely audible, but distinct, whispers. Hundreds of overlapping whispers in no language I recognized, saying words that hurt to hear, that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and speak directly to something deeper in my brain. Jennifer stumbled backward, still screaming, and knocked over the space heater. It hit the ground and sparked, and for one terrible moment I thought the tent was going to catch fire. Robert grabbed the heater, Marcus grabbed Jennifer, and I grabbed the core sample. It was a mistake. The moment my bare hands touched the ice, where I pulled off my gloves to steady the sample, the world inverted. I was no longer in the tent. I was somewhere else, somewhere vast and dark and impossibly cold. And I was not alone. There were others here with me. Countless others. Consciousnesses that had lived when the world was young and hot, that had decided together to retreat into the ice rather than die when the cold came. They had defrozen. They'd chosen the ice, embraced it, become one with it, and they'd been sleeping ever since, dreaming of the world they left behind, waiting for the heat to return. But we disturbed their sleep. Our drilling, our examination, our presence had cracked the surface of their dreaming. And now they were aware of us, curious about us, reaching out to understand what we were, these strange hot-blooded creatures that moved across their frozen home. And they were hungry, not for food, for warmth, for life, for the fire that burned inside every living thing. They'd been cold for so long, sleeping for so long, and we were the first warm things they encountered in 10,000 years. I came back to my body to find Marcus shaking me, yelling my name. I'd been standing motionless, hands frozen to the core sample, for almost 3 minutes. My fingers were blue where they made contact with the ice. Frostbite was setting in, even though I only touched it for seconds. We're leaving, Robert said. His voice had an edge of panic I'd never heard before. Right now, recalling for extraction. But when we tried the satellite phone, it wouldn't connect. The signal was gone. Not weak, not interrupted, simply gone, as if something was blocking it. Thomas appeared again, this time holding his own satellite device. Mine too, he said quietly. Nothing, like the air wand, to carry the signal anymore. The wind outside intensified. What had been a steady howl became something more rhythmic, more purposeful, like breathing. That was when the second dream started. Except we weren't asleep. We were all standing there, in the equipment tent, fully conscious, and we could see it. The hot world. The consciousnesses moving through alien forests. The decision to sleep, but this time we could see more. We could see them watching us now, from inside their frozen prison. We could feel their attention like pressure against our minds. They weren't hostile. Not exactly, but they were powerful in a way that made human thoughts seem small and fragile. And they were waking up. The vision faded, but the presence remained. Something vast was becoming aware beneath the ice. Every core we pulled had been like tapping on a window, and now the thing behind the window was tapping back. Jennifer broke first. She ran from the tent into the wind and cold, heading toward the edge of the plateau. Marcus and I chased after her, fighting against the wind that seemed determined to push us back. We caught her just before she reached the edge where the glacier dropped away into a crevasse we mapped on our first day. She was crying, but the tears froze instantly on her face. They want to show us, she kept saying. They want us to understand, but we can, our minds can, hold it. It's too much, too big. We're too small. We dragged her back to the tent. Thomas was already packing emergency supplies. Robert had abandoned the drilling equipment and was gathering only the essentials for survival. Everyone understood now. We were leaving, walking out if we had to. The helicopter couldn't come in this weather, but staying here was no longer an option. But the ice had other plans. The drilling rig, which we left running on low power to keep the borehole from freezing shut, suddenly roared to life at full power. We hadn't touched it. The control panel was in the equipment tent with us, but through the tent fabric, we could hear the drill screaming as it bit deeper into the ice. pulling up more core samples without human hands to guide it. Then the samples we already extracted began to crack. Not breaking, not shattering, cracking in patterns, geometric patterns that looked almost like writing. And from each crack, more of that strange vapor emerged, filling the tent with whispers and presences we could feel but not see. The temperature inside the tent began to drop. Not slowly, rapidly. My breath went from visible to freezing midair in seconds. Robert, his coffee, still steaming moments before, turned to slush in his cup. The space heater was running at maximum, but it made no difference. The cold was coming from somewhere else, from inside the ice itself. Marcus started laughing, not the nervous laugh from before. Something else, something broken. He pointed at the cracked samples and said, "They were not trying to hurt us. They were trying to communicate. But their language is cold. Their words are ice. They've been alone so long they've forgotten how to be gentle." He reached toward one of the cracking samples. I grabbed his arm, but it was like touching frozen meat. His skin was ice cold through his thermal layers. When I pulled my hand away, frost had formed where I made contact. "Marcus, step back," I said. But he wasn't listening. He was somewhere else now, lost in the dream that was bleeding through from the ice. Thomas moved faster than any of us expected. He grabbed Marcus around the waist and hauled him away from the samples. Then he did something I didn't expect. He pulled out a lighter, sparked it, and held the flame against one of the cracking cores. The ice hissed. The whispers became screams. The vapor recoiled from the heat like a living thing. And for just a moment, the presence that had been pressing against our minds withdrew. "Fire," Thomas said. "Fire is what they left behind. Fire is what they fear. It's the only thing that still means death to them." He moved to the space heater and cranked it as high as it would go, then grabbed one of our emergency flares and lit it. The red light filled the tent, and the temperature stopped dropping. The cracked samples stopped spreading their patterns. The whispers faded to barely audible. "We need more heat," Robert said. He was already moving, grabbing every fuel canister we had, every flare, every chemical heat pack in our supplies. We turned the equipment tent into a furnace. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal in an enclosed space on a glacier, but it was the only thing keeping the presence in the ice at bay. The samples began to melt under the intense heat, and as they melted, the pressure on our minds lessened. The dreams retreated. The whispers stopped, but I knew it wasn't over. We only touched the surface. Literally, there was so much more down there, deeper in the ice, waiting. Sleeping, dreaming of heat and life and a world long gone. We abandoned everything except survival gear and the sources of heat. The drilling rig could stay. The samples could stay. Everything that had brought us here could stay. We just needed to leave before the next dream started. Before the presence in the ice found a way to reach us that fire couldn't stop. The walk off the glacier took 6 hours. It should have taken 3. But the ice itself seemed to fight us. Crevasses appeared where our maps said there should be solid ground. The wind pushed against us with force that felt intentional. The temperature dropped to levels our weather instruments hadn't predicted. And the entire time, I could feel it watching us. The vast consciousness beneath the ice. Vast beyond understanding. Aware of us now. Curious about these small hot creatures that had disturbed its 10,000-year sleep. Jennifer collapsed twice. Marcus talked to himself the entire way, having conversations with things we couldn't see. Robert's hands were so badly frostbitten he could barely grip his pack. Thomas led us with determination born from something deeper than training or knowledge. He knew. His people had always known. Some places on the ice were meant to stay undisturbed. We reached the edge of the ice field as the sun was setting, painting the ice in shades of red and orange that looked too much like the fire world from the dreams. A bush plane was waiting at the emergency landing strip, its pilot having ignored the storm warnings to come check on us when we missed our scheduled check-in. He took one look at our faces and didn't ask questions. He just got us in the air as fast as possible. I looked back at the drilling site as we lifted off. From the air, I could see something I hadn't noticed from the ground. The ice around our camp, for hundreds of meters in every direction, had formed patterns. The same geometric patterns we'd seen in the crack samples. Like writing, like a message, or a warning. The pilot radioed ahead for medical attention. We landed in Juneau as full dark settled over Alaska. Emergency personnel were waiting. They treated our frostbite, our hypothermia, our shock. But they couldn't. They treat the dreams. We all still have them. Every night. The hot world. The decision to sleep. The vast consciousness waiting in the ice. Not nightmares exactly. Memories, but not our memories. We re-experiencing the memories of something that lived before humans, before mammals, before anything we recognize as life. Marcus is in psychiatric care now. He tried to fill his bathtub with ice water and climb in, saying he wanted to sleep like they sleep, to dream what they dream. Jennifer moved to Arizona and refuses to look at snow. Robert lost 3 fingers to frostbite and won. To talk about what happened. Thomas went back to his people and told them the old stories were true. The things his grandfather warned about were real. And now they'd been awakened, just slightly, just enough to remember that life still existed in the warm world above their frozen sleep. I stopped sleeping because every time I close my eyes, back there, in that vast cold darkness beneath the ice, and the presence is there, aware of me, curious about me. It shows me things, the world before ice, the decision to sleep, the long dream of waiting for warmth to return. And now it shows me something new, something that chills me more than any glacier ever could. It shows me the future, a warming world, melting ice, and something ancient, something vast, something that has dreamed for 10,000 years. Finally waking up into a planet of 7 billion hot, living things it doesn't. Do you understand? The drilling site was officially closed. Our research grant was quietly revoked. The area was declared geologically unstable and placed off limits. But I know the real reason. Someone else experienced what we experienced. Someone else looked at our data, our notes, our broken minds, and understood that we found something that needed to stay buried. But the ice is melting. Every year, a little more. Every year, a little faster. And somewhere beneath the Juneau ice field, something vast is sleeping a little less deeply. Dreaming a little more vividly. Remembering what it was like to live in heat and light. Do you know what happens when it fully wakes up? Do you know if it will be hostile or curious or simply indifferent to us? But I know it's coming. I can feel it in every dream, growing stronger, drawing closer to consciousness. The ice that dreams is starting to wake. And when it does, the world is going to remember that humans weren't the first ones here. We weren't even close. We were just the ones who happened to evolve during its long sleep. I stopped looking at climate reports. Stop tracking glacier melt rates. Because I know what they mean now. Every degree of warming, every ton of ice that melts into the sea, is like removing another blanket from something that has been sleeping in cold storage for longer than human civilization has existed. Sometimes, late at night when the dreams are particularly vivid, I wonder if this was always the plan. If that vast consciousness chose to sleep in the ice knowing that someday, something warm would come along and wake it up. That it was never really trapped. It was just waiting for us to dig deep enough, to disturb its rest, to crack the surface of its frozen dreams. And now we have, and it knows we're here, and it's starting to remember what warmth feels like, what life feels like, what it means to be awake in a world that is no longer sleeping. I stopped sleeping 3 weeks ago, not because I can, because I'm afraid of what is dreaming through me.